Before the end came, Ernie Terrell had one thing he couldn't shake loose. Not the title. Not the night Muhammad Ali stood over him for 15 rounds inside the Houston Astrodome, chanting, "What's my name?" while the whole world watched. Not the injustice of being a heavyweight champion the sport refused to fully acknowledge. What stayed with him, through the quiet decades after boxing, through the long Chicago winters, was the memory of certain punches. Not all punches. Certain ones. The kind that don't just knock you down. The kind that leave something behind when they land. The kind that, 40 years later, you still know exactly where you were standing when they found you. When you piece together everything Ernie Terrell said about his career across his lifetime, the interviews, the recorded testimony, the stories he carried, three names emerge more clearly than any others. Three men whose punching power he described in terms he used for no one else. He never wrote them into a formal list. He never sat down and officially declared a winner. But the evidence of what he said, what he experienced, and what the historical record confirms tells us who those men were. And the closer you look, the more it becomes clear that what Terrell remembered wasn't only about being hit hard. It was about what certain punches teach you, about yourself, about the sport, and about the particular kind of fear that lives at the center of boxing and never fully goes away. We're going to walk through all three. But first, you need to understand who Ernie Terrell was, because that's what makes any of this worth telling. He was born in Inverness, Mississippi in 1939, one of 11 children. His family picked cotton in Sunflower County under a sun that didn't care about fairness, in a county where fairness had never been the point. As a boy, he walked to the church that doubled as a school for black children, while white kids rode the bus past him and threw rocks and garbage out the windows. That was life in the Delta in the 1940s. That was what he came from. The family moved north to Chicago in the early 1950s. Part of the Great Migration, millions of black Americans leaving the Jim Crow South in search of something that at least resembled a future. In Chicago, Ernie found the Midwest Gym. He found boxing. He won the Chicago Golden Gloves and turned professional in 1957. And by the time he was still a teenager, he was already fighting on main events. By 1965, he was the WBA heavyweight champion of the world. 6'6", 82-inch reach, a jab that could measure the distance to a man's chin before his brain registered it was coming. He trained under the legendary Joe Louis. He sparred with the most feared man in boxing. He stood across the ring from some of the most dangerous human beings of the 20th century. He wasn't a big puncher himself. That matters. He was a technician, a pressure man. He'd extend that long jab, and then, when opponents got inside his reach, wrap those arms around them, tying them up, taking away their leverage, making the fight about endurance rather than sudden violence. It worked. It won him championships. But the reason he fought that way, the reason he was so committed to not being hit, is inseparable from the three men we're about to discuss. He knew what it felt like when certain punches landed. He had spent his entire career making sure it would happen as rarely as possible. The first man who showed him is someone whose name deserves to be more famous than it is. April 3rd, 1962, Sam Houston Coliseum, Houston, Texas. Ernie Terrell is 22 years old, coming in with a strong record and rising fast through the heavyweight ranks. His opponent that night is a 30-year-old man from Griffin, Georgia, who started working at a pulpwood mill at age 13 and turned professional at 14. Cleveland Big Cat Williams, 6'2", 78-inch reach, 62 knockouts in his career. The Ring magazine would later rank him among the most ferocious punchers in heavyweight history. Sonny Liston, who terrorized an entire generation of heavyweights, said Cleveland Williams was the hardest puncher he had ever been in the ring with. George Foreman, who would later dismantle Muhammad Ali's entire era like a man walking through paper, said Williams had one of the 3 hardest punches he experienced in his professional career. This is the man Ernie Terrell stepped in front of at 22 years old. The early rounds were deceptive. Terrell opened a cut under Williams's left eye inside the first minute. He was working the jab, keeping distance, playing the fight exactly the way he was supposed to. It looked, for a moment, like he might be able to outbox him. Then the 3rd round happened. Williams caught him with a left cross. Contemporary accounts describe what followed as Williams having the fight his own way from then on. Terrell survived into the 6th. Williams hit him with a right hook followed by a left cross, and Terrell went to the canvas. He climbed back up. He always climbed back up. But something about those seconds on the floor stayed with him in a way that time never erased. It wasn't just the pain. Fighters learned to accept pain. It was the quality of the punch, the way it didn't simply hit him, but seemed to relocate him, the way his legs registered what had happened before his mind finished processing it. The referee stopped the fight at 1:47 of round 7. And here's a detail that history has quietly buried. The man working the corner of the ring as referee that night was a boxer named Sonny Liston. 2 of Terrell's 3 men in the same building on the same night, years before any of them fully understood what that web of connections would mean. Terrell came back. 1 year later, April 1963, he got in the ring with Williams again. He won by split decision over 10 rounds. Smarter, longer, more controlled. He knew what was coming and made sure it didn't come as often. He won the fight, but he never stopped talking about those punches. Not because he lost the first bout, because of what those punches felt like. There are fighters who hit hard, and there are men whose punches reorganize something structural inside you. Cleveland Williams was the second kind, and in the reconstruction of everything Terrell said and experienced, he was only the beginning. The second man is one most serious boxing fans will recognize, but almost certainly not from this angle. Bob Foster. If you know the name at all, you know him as a light heavyweight. The man who held the 175-pound world championship for 6 years, from 1968 to 1974, defending the title 14 times against 13 different challengers. The Ring magazine ranked him among the 100 greatest punchers in the history of boxing. He knocked out Dick Tiger, a man who had never been stopped before, in 4 rounds to win the championship. He was so dominant in his division that critics complained he made it look too easy. But before all of that, Bob Foster was trying to make it as a heavyweight. He was 6'3". He had the reach. He had the punch. And in July 1964, he stepped into the ring with Ernie Terrell. Terrell stopped him in the 7th round. On paper, that is a clean Terrell victory. Heavyweight beats smaller man. Case closed. Except the story was more complicated than that. Foster's power came from a different place than Williams. Not the same raw mass, not the same bludgeoning weight. More precise, more sudden. His left hook in particular had a quality that boxing historians and the men who absorbed it described in strikingly similar terms across decades. It didn't push you back. It shut things off, the way a circuit breaker trips. One moment you were present in the fight, then you weren't. The transition between those 2 states was not gradual. Terrell was a man whose entire approach to boxing was built around not being hit, around keeping the fight at jab range, at the end of an 82-inch reach where he controlled the distance and nothing could reach him cleanly. Foster's punches got through anyway. That was the thing Terrell carried out of that fight, not the win, the discovery. That punching power did not recognize the weight classes printed on a contract, that a man who was technically a light heavyweight could land shots that a heavyweight champion of the world would remember for the rest of his life. History validated that entirely. When Foster committed to his natural division, he became one of the most destructive champions the sport has ever seen. 14 title defenses. The entire 175-pound landscape flattened beneath him. When he eventually moved up to challenge Joe Frazier and then Muhammad Ali at heavyweight, he lost. Those men were bigger, heavier, and it was too much weight to overcome. But even the fighters who beat Bob Foster understood what he brought into a ring. Ali later called him one of the finest pound-for-pound fighters he had ever encountered. That is the thing about the level of power Terrell was describing. It exists independent of weight, independent of division, independent of where the sanctioning body drew the line on a contract. It is either present or it isn't. And Terrell had felt it firsthand. In a fight he won, from a man who would spend the rest of his career demonstrating exactly how present it was. Which brings us to the name that sat in everything Terrell said, in a category no one else occupied. Before we say it, something needs to be established clearly. Ernie Terrell never fought Sonny Liston in a professional bout. He didn't have to, because Ernie Terrell spent extended time in the same gym with Sonny Liston, serving as one of his regular sparring partners in the early 1960s. He absorbed Liston's punches not in front of a crowd, not with a referee monitoring from the outside, but in a training gym, in relative privacy, with no one to intervene until Liston decided he was finished. In the interview that boxing historian Pete Ehrman conducted with Terrell for the International Boxing Research Organization, Terrell described Liston in language he used for no other man. No professional opponent, no one from his entire career inside the ropes. He called him the most intimidating guy I've ever seen. Not the hardest puncher, not the most dangerous fighter, not the best boxer. The most intimidating man he had ever seen. That word choice matters. By the time Terrell said it, he had been hit by Cleveland Williams. He had been hit by Bob Foster. He had spent 15 rounds with Muhammad Ali. He possessed a precise, first-hand vocabulary for what physical danger felt like inside a boxing ring. He had earned the right to that vocabulary the hard way. And the word he reached for when he talked about Sonny Liston was intimidation. Charles Sonny Liston was listed at 6'1", but those who stood next to him consistently said he seemed larger than that measurement implied. His fists were 15 inches in circumference. His jab was among the most powerful ever thrown by a heavyweight. Floyd Patterson said Liston hit him so hard in their first fight that he had dreamed about it for years afterward. Chuck Wepner needed 72 stitches after 9 rounds with him. In Cleveland Williams, the man who opens this story, the man who put Terrell on the canvas and taught him what certain punches felt like, was described by Liston himself as the hardest puncher he had ever faced. 2 of Terrell's 3 men were directly connected through that testimony. The web of punching power inside the 1960s heavyweight division was dense and strange and deeply unforgiving. Terrell remembered a specific story about Liston that captures something statistics alone cannot convey. He remembered driving in a van with Liston to Houston for Sonny's April 1960 fight with Roy Harris. On the drive, Liston was jovial, laughing, playing cards. Easy company, the kind of man you'd want beside you on a long trip through Texas. Then they arrived, and reporters were waiting outside, and Liston picked up a newspaper, a man who reportedly could not read, and used it as a shield, a prop to hide behind, and said nothing to any of them. At the weigh-in, Liston stepped on the scales with his street clothes still on, tie and all. A reporter pressed him, asked whether he was worried about a hometown decision going against him in Harris's backyard. Liston looked at the man for a moment. Decision? I came here to kill this man. If there's a decision, I don't want it. He stopped Harris in the first round. What Terrell absorbed in those sparring sessions wasn't only the physical reality of Liston's punches, though that reality was significant enough on its own. It was the psychology that lived underneath the punches. The way Liston made you feel, from the first moment of contact, that the outcome had already been settled and he was simply walking you toward it. The way his presence changed the atmosphere of a room before a word had been spoken or a glove raised. The combination, the physical power and the total psychological domination delivered simultaneously, was something Terrell carried with him for the rest of his career. It shaped how he understood danger. It informed why a man with an 82-inch reach spent his entire professional life at jab distance, keeping everyone exactly at arm's length, never inviting anyone inside to replicate what he had felt in that gym. Some things are learned from reading, some from being told, and some from being in the ring with Sonny Liston in the early 1960s, when he was at or near the peak of his powers. An understanding in your body, not your mind, your body, that there was a level of threat that no description and no film footage could have prepared you for. At some point in this story, you've been waiting for one name, Muhammad Ali, because that's the fight history attached to Ernie Terrell permanently. February 6, 1967, the Astrodome. 15 rounds while Ali circled him and refused to finish him, chanting, "What's my name?" over and over while Terrell bled and his eyes swelled shut and the world watched. Terrell came out of that night with his face destroyed, his career fundamentally altered, his legacy reduced in ways he could never fully reclaim. So why not Ali? Because Ali's power came differently. Ali's devastation was built on speed, on angles, on timing so precise it was almost impossible to prepare for, on combinations that landed before your brain had processed the one before. He was genuinely dangerous. He stopped men. He hurt men. He took people apart with an accuracy that approached something architectural. Nobody who stood across from Muhammad Ali in his prime walked away thinking it had been easy. But the three men in Terrell's memory hit with mass, with a kind of weight behind the punch that you could sometimes see arriving and still could not prevent from doing what it was going to do. They hit through guards. They hit through arms. They hit through the best defensive posture you had to offer. Ali went around the guard, went through the spaces, made the guard beside the point by making it impossible to track where the next shot was originating. That was its own form of terrifying, a completely different form. Terrell said once about Ali, about the whole political storm and personal history, and that night in Houston, we did the best we could. 5 words, no bitterness that you could hear, no grievance wearing the costume of peace, just the quiet, composed acknowledgement of a man who had given a brutal sport everything he had and received back from it exactly what the sport decided to give. Ernie Terrell passed away on December 16, 2014, 75 years old, Evergreen Park, Illinois, not far from the city that had taken in his family 6 decades earlier, that had given him the gym and the gloves and the long road north from Mississippi that led eventually to a world heavyweight championship most of the world refused to fully honor. History has not been generous with him. He held a world heavyweight title during one of the most competitive eras the division has ever produced. He defeated men, Williams, Chuvalo, Foster, Mason Jones, whose names belong in any serious accounting of 1960s heavyweight boxing. He was trained by Joe Louis. He sparred with Sonny Liston. By any honest measure, he was one of the finest heavyweights of his generation, and history reduced him largely to a supporting character in someone else's story. But there is another story, the one that lives in what he said and what he survived and what he carried. Cleveland Williams, who put him on the canvas and taught him what it meant to absorb a punch from a man for whom hitting wasn't a skill so much as a natural force. Bob Foster, who showed him that punching power had nothing to do with the weight division written on a contract, and that a light heavyweight with the right left hook could rearrange a heavyweight champion's understanding of danger. And Sonny Liston, who taught him something that went beyond punching power entirely, that the most dangerous thing about a truly great puncher is not what he does to your body. It's what he does before he touches you. The way he makes you feel from the first moment you're near him, that the distance between where you are and where he is isn't a physical gap, but a psychological sentence already handed down. Fighters don't remember every fight. The rounds blur with time. The opponent's faces soften and merge into one long, continuous career of preparation and consequence. What stays, what always stays, are the moments your body understood something your mind was still catching up to. The moments you realized some men were built at a different level, that some punches belonged to a different category entirely. Ernie Terrell knew 3 of those men. He carried them from Houston to Chicago to the end of his life. And now, so do you.